Okay. Len, actually, we're recording now. I'll let you take it away, Len.
So good evening, everyone. My name is Leonard Silverman. I'm the chair of the Community Education Council for District 2 Community Engagement Committee. This is a CEC District 2 Community Engagement event. This is our first book talk event. If you want to know about future book talk events, please sign up on the CEC District 2 website and follow us on Twitter at CEC District 2. This evening will be recorded and posted on the CECdistrict2.net website, or actually, I'm sorry, YouTube channel. Now I would like to introduce our guest, Robert Pondiscio. Robert Pondiscio is a senior fellow at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. He also teaches civics at Democracy Prep Public Schools, a network of charter schools based in Harlem, New York. He writes and speaks extensively on education and education reform issues with an emphasis on literacy, curriculum, teaching, and urban education. His fantastic 2019 book, How the Other Half Learns, based on a year of observations at New York City Success Academy network of charter schools, has sparked conversations throughout the educational world. Robert's education career began as a teacher in the South Bronx. He has also served as vice president for the Core Knowledge Foundation. His articles and op-ed columns on education have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, the New York Daily News, Education Next, and many other publications. Welcome, Robert. We are very happy to have you here as our first book talk series author. I will now turn this over to our CEC president, Maud, who will begin our discussion.
Thank you, Len. And welcome, Robert. I think that a fair number of folks here are familiar with your work and this book, but just for those who are not, your most recent book, How the Other Half Learns, and it's from your reporting about being embedded in a Success Academy in the Bronx, and it was in fact a Success Academy across the street from a school in the Bronx where you first taught. Mm-hmm. Can you share why you wanted to spend so much time inside a Success Academy and what you hoped to learn?
Sure. Thanks. Thank you for the question. Thanks for having me. And let me also just start by apologizing. You can see that I'm sitting in a car, which is not normally how I do these things. But I'm in the middle of the northern Catskills, and my Wi-Fi is out. So I've got a hotspot on a mountaintop, almost literally overlooking Oak Hill, New York. I can get online. So forgive me in advance for a truck driving by or the farmer next door taking hay off. We'll muddle through. You know, I occupy a very strange place in education policy and analysis. I say this all the time, but most people who work at think tanks and who do education policy writing tend to focus on the structures of education, things like charter schools and teacher quality and data and assessment. And I say this all the time. I'm the weird guy who says, can we talk about what the kids do all day? In other words, I focus on curriculum, on instruction, on school culture, for example, because those things matter. I mean, I was a District 7 South Bronx grade teacher for 5 years, ending about 10 years ago, and it's always struck me as just kind of odd that we don't really focus enough on what kids are learning and what the pedagogy is, etc. So for all of the attention that Success Academy and Eva Moskowitz had gotten over the years, I didn't feel like I had a very good sense of what do the kids do all day there. So back in 2014, if I'm remembering correctly, shortly after Common Core testing hit, everybody just took it on the chin. Scores went down precipitously. Success Academy scores went up, and not just by a little, but by a lot. And I remember writing a piece in the New York Daily News at the time that asked the question, sports fans will get the analogy, in print asking, is Eva Moskowitz the Michael Jordan of standardized testing or the Mark McGuire? And that somebody needs to go to Harlem and figure out how this is happening. For those who are not sports people, Michael Jordan is this fantastic NBA star. Mark McGuire was a steroids cheater in Major League Baseball. So that ended up being me. So some years later, when they continued this extraordinary run of just literally no bad Success Academy schools, despite how much they were growing, I talked my way into embedding in one of their schools, as you mentioned, Maud, literally across the street from where I was a student teacher and a few blocks away from where I taught 5th grade. And I spent a year really focusing on what happens inside of those schools. Not the stuff other people focused on, not that they're not important, the funding, the politics, the fundraisers, but what's the instructional program.
So thank you for that. A lot of the reviews and some of the discussion about the book focused on, or one of the main takeaways was that that the accusation sometimes leveled at Success Academy that they cherry pick their students was not true, but that there is a selection of sort that happens with parents. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, and it's interesting because there were a lot of takeaways. And I'll answer the question in a moment. But before the book came out, or when it came out, I wrote a piece for the education news site, the 74, which you may be familiar with, and the piece had this title, kind of puckish but earnest, which was, "Here's my new book. I hope you hate it." And I meant it earnestly. What I meant is that, and again, and I can, point out my ed reform. I'm a charter guy. I'm an ed reform guy, but that doesn't mean I'm not clear-eyed about this. So there are things in this book that, if you are a charter proponent, should make you uncomfortable, and there are things, if you are a charter school hater, should make you uncomfortable. So there hasn't been, I think, just one takeaway. It's actually been a little bit disappointing. People, don't get me wrong, it's nice to get a nice review, but whenever people praise the book from one point of view or the other, I'm thinking, so you didn't focus on the parts that don't confirm your priors, right? So that's kind of interesting. I'm sorry, now I've completely forgotten your question, Maud.
About the parents, the selection on the parents.
Sorry, the selection. Yeah, see, I do that. I talk myself off a cliff. Yeah, no, you're right. The conventional wisdom has been for years that success is cherry picking students. The response has been, well, we can't do that. It's a lottery system. We have no control. I don't think this is much of a spoiler, because this has been hiding in plain sight for years. But what the book really kind of details, and again, you can only see this if you're there every day, is that they're not really cherry picking students. They're kind of cherry picking parents. And let me qualify that somewhat, because it's not as if they have the means to say, I want this parent and not that parent. There is a long, rather involved application process. So the rough numbers, and I haven't looked at the most recent years, but within a year or two ago, there were roughly 6 applicants for every 1 seat. But when you do the math, your chances of getting in are closer to 1 in 2, not 1 in 6. And that's because once you win a seat in the lottery, well, then a process begins. You have to come to a welcome meeting. You have to confirm your interest in email. You have to come to a uniform fitting, even if you're only on the waiting list, etc. There's any number of what I would describe as non-trivial hurdles. I mean, they're doable, but they're just hurdles. You got to just parents have to kind of show up and show up and show up. So I think this has discernibly, it has the effect of dissuading the least engaged parents. They just tend to fall away. And I should also point out that at every step of this process, Success Academy messages to prospective parents quite aggressively. As I like to say, this is what we stand for, and this is what we will not stand for. And they make it clear, this is who we are, this is what we do, and we're not changing for you or for anybody. So, they kind of actively invite parents who are not really down with the program, so to speak, to choose another school. So, and again, let me be clear, I'm not a researcher. My approach here is journalistic. It's impossible to prove, is it 100% of the parents who are aggressively or actively buying what Eva Moskowitz is selling? Probably not. But the point that I make in the book is that, look, it's you get a critical mass of deeply engaged parents who are either buying what Eva Moskowitz is selling or are willing to go along with the program. So, and I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting, and no one should assume that I'm suggesting, that that's how they do it, that it's those parents that are driving the results. But anybody who spent any time at all in the classroom will tell you it's just easier to get more done when you have engaged parents, when you have, when every adult in a child's life, so to speak, is singing from the same hymnal, when everybody wants the same for their kids. So as I think I said in the book, I walked in expecting to write a book about curriculum and instruction. I ended up writing a book about school culture, because I think that's the culture when you have the vast majority of adults in a child's life reinforcing the same messaging with the same set of expectations, that leads to these results, and I think at least in some significant way explains them.
Okay. There's a lot in there.
Yeah.
Let me.
I got to learn to center myself a little
No,
bit
no,
more.
no, no, no. It's great because those are things I wanted to ask you about. One other, before we I wanted to ask you some questions about how this book relates to District 2, because or some of the conversations we're having in District 2, I should say. But before we get there, there was one more sort of broad question that I had for you, and that is, in the book, you refer to something you call the Tiffany test for schools. And the name comes from a particularly bright student that you had in your early days of teaching, that you report not having been able to engage or challenge enough, or as you wish you had been able to. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
yeah. I
and
couldn't engage. Sure, I was literally told not to. That's
okay.
that's the frustration. In other words, and I think this is sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm not sure.
No, it sounds like you're starting to answer the question I was going to ask, which is, why did that happen, and how does that inform your thinking about what schools should be doing now to meet the needs of students like Tiffany?
Thank you. Yeah, and I think I said this in the book that this 10-year-old girl in my second year at PS 277 quite literally has had a greater impact on my educational career than any administrator, teacher, scholar, researcher, etc. So the story's worth telling. And some background about my school. I mean, I think most of us who are on this call know this, but District 7 in the South Bronx is, by some margin, the poorest performing community school district in the city of New York. It was 20 years ago when I was teaching. It still is today, as far as I know. The school where I taught, PS 277 in St. Mary's or St. Anne's Avenue in 148th, was the lowest performing school in District 7. So it was literally the lowest of the low. More than 80% of the kids, close to 90% of the kids, getting levels 1 and 2. And I'm talking to New Yorkers, so I don't have to explain what a level 1 and 2 is, and then there was this young lady, Tiffany, who was, as we would have said, a double 3, meaning she was on grade level in math and reading. And this was in the early 2000s when, if you remember, there was this kind of race to the bottom in terms of the standardized testing just being prodigiously dumbed down. The cut scores were lowered. It was just a colleague of mine did a back of the envelope study where she demonstrated that you could literally randomly guess and have a decent shot at getting a 3 and at the very least a 2. So getting a 3, this is not a criticism of this young lady, Tiffany. It was not exactly like she was, doing fantastically. She was just doing better than just about everybody else in the school. So when I pointed out to my special ed supervisor one day, look, I've got this girl named Tiffany. And by the way, it's worth noting, she was just this incredible kid. I mean, deeply bought into what we were doing. This was, a fairly chaotic school, and this young lady would come to school every day in her uniform, homework done, literally never missed a day of school. She kind of came to school with the idea her mother had told her, like, the teacher is God and what he says goes. So she was just profoundly bought into the promise of education. So when I pointed out to my special ed supervisor, hey, look, I'm not doing anything for this kid, she said these words which kind of changed my career. She said, quote, "She's not your problem." And that may have been well-intended advice, but what she meant is, look, you've got all these other kids, Pondiscio, who are levels 1s and 2s. What are you worried about Tiffany? She's delivering the results we need, that you need. She's on grade level. Focus on other things. But think about that. If this were your child, my child, nobody says this. Nobody would dream of saying this to the teacher of a child of an affluent New Yorker, right? So that just makes it quite clear that there's a prodigious double standard. And I think I said this in the book as well. Tiffany's finish line, read on grade level, graduate on time. Well, that's the starting line for my kid, for your kid. We could unpack at deathless length the reasons for that, that advice. But, you've also got to kind of, live with that in a sense and look at it and say, wait a minute, how do we get to the point where any teacher is being told, that kid's not your problem, that this kid who is, kind of subsisting on just like starvation rations of education is getting a good enough education. It's not good enough for my child. I can't say that it was good enough for Tiffany. And so, back to Success Academy, 10 years later, I'm at Success Academy Bronx 1. What do I see in every seat? Tiffany. I mean, that kind of kid, that bought in, dialed in, never miss a day of school, never miss a homework assignment. The teacher said it and I believe it kid. Where Tiffany was the outlier, so to speak, in my school. There was no Success Academy when she was in my fifth grade class. But had there been, she would have been, in retrospect, the Success Academy kid from Central Casting. She would have been, the culture keeper, as opposed to the outlier. And just to finish the story, I mean, I'm still in touch with this young lady. She's fantastic. She's now in her mid to late 20s. She graduated from college, a state university in Pennsylvania. It took her, I think, 6 years, not 4. And she's working as a junior marketer for a tech firm somewhere in Pennsylvania. So maybe my special ed supervisor was right, that she was fine. But I mean, let's not kid ourselves. It's not because of what I did or anybody in my school did for her. It's in spite of that.
Yeah, I think there's, yes, I think there are probably a lot of Tiffany's out there. So that's why I asked, and thank you for giving.
Yeah.
Yes.
And whenever I tell that story to teachers, they're like, "Oh yeah, I've got a Tiffany, or I've
Yeah.
got 2 Tiffany's, or 4 Tiffany's." Yeah,
Right.
they're legion.
So I want to I have one more, and thank you for that. And I think that gives folks either a refresher if you read this book a few months ago, or some sense if you're haven't gotten to it yet, sort of where of this book and of the conversations that this book brought about. I'd like to turn, if it's okay with you, to a few comments about District 2, since this is a Community Education Council District 2 event. And then I am going to also take questions from folks if folks have specific questions for you. And folks can certainly write about this, ask you about this book, but if it's okay with you also, anyone who follows you on Twitter or follows you that knows that there's a whole range of education issues that you talk about. And I think folks could.
Can I make one quick comment that I meant to make? And sorry, I've been monologuing to death here. But this is an issue for District 2 and for District 7, where I used to teach in every community school district. Most people who do what I do for a living, good ed reformers will tell you things like, oh, well, charters and choice create a rising tide that lifts all boats and there's no downstream effects. And again, I'm a charter and choice advocate, but I listen to that idea that this has no downstream effects to say, well, that can't possibly be true. Because I could tell you, if you take Tiffany out of my classroom, my job gets harder. Okay, so I'm actually, I'm more sympathetic with the anti-charter argument, or at least I refuse to buy into the ed reform argument that there is no downstream effect. There is, in my opinion, but significantly, I don't think we have the right as policymakers to deny an opportunity to the Tiffany's of the world just because it makes a public school's job, quote, harder.
That is a little bit, that is a strain of where I was going with my question as it relates to District 2. I mean, District 2, since you're familiar with it and the folks on here are, it's often referred to as affluent or privileged, although we certainly have students and families who are neither.
Quite a range.
Yeah. Yes. And there are not many charters, although we do have a Success Academy in District 2. There are not many charters, and our schools are full, often with wait lists, so we don't have a lot of possible co-locations knocking on our door. And that, I'm sure, prompts some people to ask why this book for our book series. But there is, if I can quote you, there are 2 quotes in your book that jumped out at me that I think help explain why I think some of what you wrote about in this book relates to our district. And the first quote is, quote, "Genuine education equity will be achieved only when schools serving low-income children mirror in number, variety, and access the options that affluent parents have come to expect for their children." And you were just touching on that a little bit. And the second quote is, quote, "Even to suggest that school culture matters is significant or determinative in this context, meaning parental engagement, student motivation, and a focused and intentional effort to direct it by educators, violates the egalitarian impulses that undergird the education reform movement's lofty ideal and much current policy and practice." big thought. And maybe you could unpack that a little bit for us, because I think as District 2, you know, we hear a great deal, especially from this administration, about the changes that should be happening to the schools that are in our district right now. And the equity arguments are often referencing children who aren't in the district. Although, as I said, we have students in temporary housing in our district. We have students who score 1s and 2s on state exams or English language learners. But we have, you know, 50% of the kids in our district score a 4 on the state exams, which is supposedly, you know, above proficiency. Is 75 to 80% of our kids are either proficient or above proficient. So when people are talking about the children who are falling through the cracks or who are not getting the education they're often talking about kids like from Community School District 7. But the changes that are being are for every district and every school. And that I'm not sure that that always makes sense. Sorry for that not very specific question, but it was those quotes that jumped out at me.
Well, I mean, I'm gonna, you know, disappoint you by saying, look, at the end of the day, I spend most of my time looking at curriculum and instruction and school culture, and it gives me the convenient excuse to avoid these kinds of questions because I frankly don't have a good answer for you. You know, I mean, what I will say, and what I was thinking of in that when I wrote that particular passage you cited, I mean, full disclosure, my daughter was a private school kid. Further full disclosure, if we're up to me, my daughter probably would have gone to a public school in District 2. Frankly, if it were up to me, we would have raised our daughter elsewhere. You know, I joke that I was a public school kid. My wife was a private school girl, and private school was the price of peace in our home, and goodness, what a price. But it was instructive to me I started my public school teaching fairly late in life. It was right around the same time that my daughter was interviewing all over for private schools. And it was just fascinating to listen to well-off, frankly, mostly Upper East Siders, talking about the differences between, say, you know, a Brearley and a Chapin or a Collegiate and a Horace Mann, you know, as if they were the differences between looking at the moon and walking on the moon. And I remember when I was getting impatient with this, saying to my wife, look, you know, the choices for us and for, you know, these other parents are good, better, and best. The choices for my parents as a teacher were bad, worse, and forgive me, holy shit. You know, in other words, there were just no good choices whatsoever in the South Bronx. So, you know, I can't solve for you, and I don't have a good solution for the kind of, you know, intra-community district mixing and matching that this administration is trying to do. And please don't put me in the awkward position of trying to defend what this mayor and chancellor are doing. But I think it's important, those of us who are, you know, have those good, better, best choices, to at least have some appreciation that the vast majority of our fellow citizens in the city of New York do not have anything like good, better, and best to choose from. Look, I'm a school choice guy, and again, while this is not a very articulate policy position, it's an injustice that we have to look at. In other words, you know, the other thing too. I just said that my daughter went to private school. Well, when we took our child out of the public school system, that was unremarkable, right? It was uncontroversial. When Neva Moskowitz comes along and creates some kind of similar opportunity for low-income kids of color in places like the South Bronx and you know, Bushwick or whatnot, well, that's a controversy. So let's grapple with that as well. So it's what fascinates me is not the mechanics of fixing this. It's that we have, and this is why the book is titled "How the Other Half Learn." It's because we have these parallel structures. One exists utterly without controversy, and the other sets people's hair on fire.
Well, when you said that that you do think that there's a downstream effect from taking a student like a Tiffany out of your classroom, do you think there's a similar effect there, or there's an upside to what has some of the equity proposals or proposals to make our schools more equitable have been to eliminate gifted and talented programs, to eliminate screen programs. And I think the impulse arguably there is the same, that you take students who would otherwise be your high achieving students and mix them in with the broad range of students in a district or a system. Do you think that, do you think that's a solution to explore or follow?
It's a solution. Is it the best solution? I don't know. I mean, again, I hate sounding like I'm being mealy mouthed about this. But one other reason that I focus so much of my work on curriculum and instruction is because I was made militant, I guess I would say, by the just really poor curriculum and instruction that I was taught to use in my South Bronx classroom, and taught that this was, best in class instruction. And once I became, I took it upon myself to learn more about the world of curriculum instruction, then realized that we were just doing tremendous harm to kids. Let's fix that. So that my first line of response to the issues of inequity, which I take quite seriously. I mean, every kid I've ever taught up to and including last Friday has been a low-income kid of color. I get it earnestly. But the caliber of instruction they're getting at the get-go is pretty poor. And this is where it gets uncomfortable for some people, because, my work with the Core Knowledge Foundation was cited before. A lot of language proficiency and language development, it does have cultural baggage attached to it. Those of us who grow up in what you might call the dominant language culture have an advantage. And it's not merely because, our parents are affluent. It's because our parents speak in full sentences in standard English, and they went to college and they have bigger vocabularies, etc. So there's a disadvantage that low-income families from different cultures have immediately. Then you put them in low-performing schools. Then you put them in schools with terrible curriculum. Then you give them unprepared teachers, and there's a cascading effect. So it's not as if, I hope I'm not offending anybody in District 2. It's not as if the quality of instruction and curriculum in District 2 is so much better. It's just affluent parents can somewhat failure-proof their kids a little bit. In other words, the cultural conditions, the economic conditions exist that kind of, your kids are going to school on day one with more language, with more vocabulary. I discuss this in the book. It's called the Matthew effect, which we can talk about if you want. They're just primed and pumped and ready to go, and the students like the one that I've taught in the past are trying to be ushered to the starting line. And so, again, when you condense all those factors in one classroom, then it's just really, really hard to move forward.
So that was a little bit of a teaser. So I will ask you what the Matthew effect is, and then I will go to, I think the way we can do it, since we're not an overly large group, is people can raise their hand. If you go to the bottom of your screen, and to participants, I believe, if I have that right, you can raise your hand, and we can call on folks, or you can put it in the chat that you have a question, and we can unmute folks. But Robert, what is the Matthew effect?
Yeah, I'll summarize it poorly. It was a phrase that was coined by a cognitive scientist at the University of Toronto named Keith Stanovich. And I'm not a good enough Bible student to quote the verse correctly, but it's the Bible verse that from the Gospel of Matthew that basically says the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. If you are the well-off child of educated, articulate parents with big vocabularies who read to their kids every night, the conditions are prime for you to develop ever more knowledge and vocabulary. If you don't have those conditions in your home environment, then you are further behind. In other words, think of it. If you think of language and knowledge as kind of mental Velcro, the Matthew effect gets to the point or illustrates the amount of mental Velcro you have. So, more fortunate kids go to school at age 4 with a lot of Velcro, a lot of mental furniture, and that makes it sticky to get new knowledge, to get new vocabulary. If you have less of that, not through any cognitive issue, just because you didn't grow up in those language-rich conditions, then you're going to fall behind. So the rich get richer, the poor get poorer in knowledge, in language, and vocabulary, because of those 0 to 4 conditions.
I knew that there was someone in here who would know that Bible verse very well, and so we have it in the chat if somebody wants to
there it is.
that.
I see it.
Yes.
For unto everyone that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance, but from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath, which in plain English, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer.
And thank you, Donalda, for that.
Yes.
I didn't realize that was
My
you.
father is a Southern Baptist minister, so if I didn't know that one, I'm in real trouble.
That's
And
very
then
impressive.
Malcolm Gladwell has a very good chapter 2 of Outliers, which is all about the Matthew effect and student birthdays and student.
It
yes.
explains so much. It explains so much.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much. I will now, I'll stop hogging all the question opportunities and go to questions or open it up, I should say, for questions from folks here. We have a few things that folks have posted in the chat. Is anyone who posted anything in the chat would like to share their thoughts or ask that as a question out loud?
Well, I'm looking at the chat and I'm noticing somebody, it's not a question, but mentioning that some kids, I guess at Success Upper West, out-tested the Anderson School. This to me is the proof point. I alluded to this earlier and I didn't quite articulate it well enough. If you want to argue, because this was the controversy in my book, a lot of Success Academy critics who have accused them of cheating looked at what I uncovered and said, aha, look, see, it's parental selection. We told you that all that glitters is not gold. Well, and I want to be clear, it's not my job to be Eva Moskowitz's cheerleader here. But if that's your view of it, then you need to explain how starting with a audience of self-selected parents who raised their hand and went through this admissions process, how they outscore things like Anderson and the gifted and talented programs. I don't have the data at arm's length, but Success Academy is big enough now to have, with like 40 some odd schools, 18,000 students, they'd be a decent sized New York State school district. And if they were a standalone district, they would be by far the highest performing one in the state of New York. So if you want to explain, or if you want to say, well, that's because even if they are cherry picking parents or creating the self-selection mechanism, well, the gifted and talented programs literally handpick their kids and they don't score as well. Jericho and Scarsdale and whatnot might as well. The price of admission there is your ability to afford a $2 million home, and they don't score as well. So clearly there's a value add component there. So the critics don't seem to have a good explanation for that.
I am going to, let's see. I tried to unmute Yuri Nazaroff. Yuri, I can read your question that you typed into the chat if you like. Oh, Yuri, you're unmuted.
Yes, hi, thanks so much.
Would you like to ask your question?
Sure, Robert, loved your book, read it the day it came out.
Thank you.
The question I have is, so a lot of well-educated professionals who have good school options choose to send their kids to a Success Academy instead of a good zone school or a district G&T program. I'm curious if you can comment on the strength of success compared to, let's say, a good zone school and a G&T program. And the reason I ask is because there is this narrative I hear a lot. When people say, well, yeah, perhaps SA is marginally better than some of our worst schools, but it's really not that great because it emphasizes test prep and rote, but not critical thinking. So SA kids don't learn at a high level. Do you agree, and can you comment? And that is something that hasn't really been covered much.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. And look, I've never really been in the business, and to the degree that I was, I'm out of the business of telling parents what they should like. One of the failures, I think, of the education reform movement is that we have encouraged a very narrow view of what a good school is. Kind of, by their test scores, shall you know them. There are schools that get really good test scores that I wouldn't send my daughter to. There are schools that may not have. We took her out of one of the best private schools in the city and sent her to one. That other parents think, why'd you do that? Well, it was a better school for her. So it's not all test scores. And the other thing, by the way, with the private school parents, they don't even know what the test scores are because there are no tests. They use other metrics. So, implied in your question is, well, what's the right metric to view a school? You mentioned test prep. Does Success Academy do a lot of test prep? Oh, yes, they do. They do an awful lot of test prep. Do they stop what they're doing in order to test prep? No, not exactly, but I think I said this in the book. Their curriculum is kind of test preppy. in a normal day. So it really becomes a question of, well, what do you like about a school? Do you like your child to have a fairly codified school culture, the uniforms, the behavior management? My dad was forever trying to send me to military academy when I was a kid, and I kind of wish that he had. I could have used that. So that school would have been perfect for me. For my daughter, she would have been just fine there. For your kids, I can't say. But I mean, it really is about, have I met parents, especially frankly, well-off parents, who are lulled in by the test scores and get there and say, yeah, this is not for us, and then leave in middle school? Absolutely. I met a lot of parents, especially, I mean, not everything that you report ends up in the book, but I did meet quite a few parents in, say, Cobble Hill, Brooklyn, who just decided to leave. So it's really about, well, what do you want for your child from a school? And it's also about, what are my alternatives? I mean, the question I've probably gotten the most, it's a similar question, Yuri, is, and this comes from people who don't like success, and they think it's a gotcha question. So it's like, well, Pondiscio, would you send your child to Success Academy? And my earnest answer is, well, what are my options? In other words, would I have sent my daughter to Success Academy Bronx 1 instead of her Upper East Side private school? No, I would not, and neither would you. Would I send her to Success Academy instead of PS 277, where I used to teach? Oh, yes, I would, and so would you. So it's, unless you have a broad range of choice, or the means to exercise choice independently of the system, there's almost a, how many angels are dancing on the head of a pin kind of sense to that question. It's really hard to answer unless you know exactly what the options are for that parent and what that child's interests are. But sorry, I'm giving long-winded answers to everything tonight. If anybody has the idea that no well-off white parent would ever send their child to Success Academy, well, that's just not right. I mean, there are no small number of them who do, and are happy with it, and there are no small number of those who try it and say, not for me.
Okay, we have a hand up. I see Jennifer DeWolf Payne. Would you like to?
She's been unmuted.
You're unmuted, Jennifer. Oh, Jennifer, we can't hear you.
I just.
There you go. Now we can hear you.
You started to touch on this a bit. I actually kind of have two questions. When my daughter was in elementary school, she's in middle school now, and they started doing the third grade standardized tests. The principal did a Q&A session, and he said that there was a rule in New York City public schools that they could not spend more than a total of 2% of class time on test prep, which I thought was great, because I don't think that test prep is education. But do you think that Success Academy spends more than 2% and could, of class time on test prep? And could that be one of the reasons for their better test scores? And then my other question, with regard to cherry picking students, it's also my understanding that Success Academy has something like 4 or 5 times the suspension rates of public schools, and that's one way that they kind of weed out the underperformers.
Yeah, I missed part of the question about suspension rates, but I think I can intuit. You'll interrupt me if I get it wrong. I'm frankly not aware of the 2% rule, and it would be really difficult to enforce, and also really difficult to codify. I hinted at this before. In other words, one of the criticisms of Success is that they stop everything in January for what they call Think Mastery Season test prep. Well, that's not entirely true, but their reading curriculum, at least in the elementary grades, has a lot of attack strategies built in that might feel like test prep to other teachers. So the lines get quite blurry, I think. But would I calculate that they spent more than 2% of the school year on test prep? I would guess it's probably more than less. Yeah, absolutely. If you add it all up and divide by the number of hours, it wouldn't surprise me if it was more than 2%. The suspensions are interesting. Spoiler alert for those who haven't read the book, and this is another part of it that kind of horrified people, especially Success Academy fans. There was a kid in the book, I don't use his real name, I give him a pseudonym, who his parents wanted him very badly to remain a success. And they tell a horrific story about, basically, they felt that they were being intimidated out of the school. The kid was suspended a lot. Had 911 called to, when he had meltdowns, taken out of the building, etc. And it's kind of interesting because he was clearly, having spent a lot of time in that kid's classroom, he was clearly an outlier. In other words, he absolutely had behavior problems, and including, one or two just prodigious meltdowns that I witnessed. What's interesting to me as somebody who spent so much time teaching in District 7 is, have I seen behaviors like that? Oh yeah, on days ending in Y. In other words, it was fairly common. But there it stood out like a sore thumb, which was kind of fascinating to me. So I mean, and here's again the whole book is a Rorschach test. Everything about Success Academy is a Rorschach test. You're gonna have the spin on it probably that either confirms your priors or doesn't. Could I say that this kid was counseled out? No, I couldn't. I mean, I don't know that he was. I don't think that he was. But could the culture of the place and the constant pushback to parents just wear parents down to the fact that to the point where it might as well be? Yeah, that's a reasonable assumption as well. Another example. Sorry, this doesn't have to do with suspensions. But I mean, they make this quite clear from the beginning, from the word go, the welcome meeting in kindergarten. If your kid, hits, talks back, kicks, etc., we will suspend your kid even in kindergarten. So, parents know this walking in the door. I'm not saying that this makes it right or wrong, but the culture could not be made clearer to parents what they're buying into. And then when their kids, do not prove to be a good fit for this culture, well, they get suspended. Success would say, well, we told you this would happen. I just don't feel comfortable as an analyst, as a journalist, saying, well, this is counseling out, this is harassment, this is inappropriate. Because if nothing else, they could not have been clearer about that. Now, I'm not sure that that's a satisfactory answer to you, but it's what I observed.
Yes, I had a question.
I guess another way to put it is did I think there was a much greater leniency for misbehavior and lack of focus and discipline, for lack of a better word, when I was teaching in the public school system than I ever saw at Success Academy. Now, you can I will let others judge whether that's fair and appropriate or not. But the big difference at the end of the day was not the curriculum instruction. It was the school culture, and it was those kinds of conditions that I think make the big difference for kids. And by the way, here we go again. That's what low-income parents in places like the South Bronx are dying for, because and that's why they line up in such prodigious numbers to get into these kinds of schools, because they are safe, they are well run, they are orderly, and their kids are safe all day. It's a real thing.
I want to, hey Lynn, before we go to you, Garrett, you've been posting in the chat. Did you want to ask a question?
Maybe it's kind of an observation that has come about, and our son is starting 8th grade next year, so we've been a success since kindergarten for our oldest son, and our youngest is in 2nd grade this year, going to 3rd. And one thing that I've been noticing is the way the state tests are organized is they're very heavy on comprehension, and you can walk into that test, and as long as you have been rehearsed on how the test is structured, everything you need to do well on the test is in the test. You read the passage, you answer some questions about the passage. You interpret the passage, maybe you do a short answer, but what I'm afraid has happened now after 7 or 8 years of this is that kids are not prepared for what's coming in 8th grade when they have in Success Academy. They take 3 Regents exams in 8th grade. And in the Regents exam, I found out today in a meeting from school, is they have to bring knowledge to the test. They've got to remember dates and names and events in a way that they have never had to do in a significant way. And it's that shift to the older style of teaching that strikes me as being very stark. And I'm not saying that the way they've been doing it for the last 7 years is bad, but it's one of the things that highlights for me very quickly today how the reintegration into outside standards that success can't control exposes them to a style of education that many would say is outdated or not as structured around the common core methods of comprehension and articulating ideas. And so it's the downside to what I've noticed also. So success is an extremely good business model. Operationally, they are as good as FedEx compared to the U.S. Post Office. They are JetBlue compared to Pan American Airlines. And they work great, and they've got some great ideas, like the principal has nothing to do with the building. They have an operations team that worries about the building. Brilliant idea. Every school should replicate that. The principal shouldn't worry about the mopping in that back hallway or the dirty bathroom. They should worry about teaching the teachers to teach. And that's one of the many examples of what it's like they sat down in a Harvard Business School and wrote the perfect business plan on how to operate a school. And they do it very well. The operational aspects are extremely good. But when I'm, at the same time, a great operations is going to say, gosh, if we have our teachers grade 100 kids' homework every day of the week for accuracy, they're going to be working until 3 a.m. every night. So apparently, we learned this past year, they grade for accuracy 1 day a week, and the other 4 days they grade for completion. You don't know which day it is, but I actually ended up discovering for my son when I would go over homework with him, he's like, I don't have to get it right. I just have to get it done. And I was like, oh my God, how can that function? And so there's a challenge in the way that it's operationally excellent, but operationally excellent also means that there's some things that are a little bit uncomfortable for me. And what I've sensed, and maybe this boy thing, it's like the counterpoint to the Tiffany example. Boys, as I gather, they're efficiency experts. They will find the way to do the absolute bare minimum. And he will devote more energy to memorizing all 900 forms of Pokemon and every element that's available in Minecraft. But God forbid you try to get him to do practice on math or to write more than the bare minimum on an assignment. And so we're struggling right now with how to reset his joy for learning. That it's not that they killed the joy for learning, they just made it very obvious if you pay attention how to game this, how to get by. And maybe that's very representative of real life, unfortunately, but it's something, it's an issue that I want to see a solution to coming from success.
Well, if two things, I mean, you threw out a lot there, but let me respond to two specific points, one on testing and the other on homework. And this has to do with kind of the operational model, which I agree with you is kind of the real genius. They know how to run schools, and they do it quite well, which is why I think there's nearly 50 of them, and literally not a bad one according to their test scores at least. I mean, they've cracked the code on that. So how do they do that? Well, I mean, first of all, it's interesting. I've said a couple of times that my kind of bailiwick is curriculum and instruction, and the reason that happened, that's not just because I'm interested in it. It's because I was scandalized by what you just described, but in the opposite. So in other words, the way I was taught to teach reading to my struggling fifth graders, back in the South Bronx, was, it's all about student engagement. Let them read what they want. It's all reading strategies. It's all reading comprehension. Well, I'm a unapologetic disciple of a guy named E.D. Hirsch Jr., who wrote Cultural Literacy years ago and founded the Core Knowledge Foundation. And I've told the story, a million times. He's the one guy who described what I saw in my classroom every single day. Kids who could decode, read the words, but could not comprehend. And all the metacognitive comprehension strategies work we would do under the sun had no effect whatsoever. So it's interesting. You and I would agree. We would read a reading passage on a test and say, well, all the answers are in there. You can gamify this. It's bewildering for a new teacher or somebody who's not schooled in this stuff, and it's frustrating. And there's a phenomenon that you see when you teach struggling kids, which is somebody described as, well, I read it, but I don't get it. Even though the answers appear to be right there in front of them, they still don't get it, and it has nothing to do with cognition or metacognition. It has to do with lack of background knowledge. So I respectfully disagree with you somewhat with the idea that you can game For math, it might be a different question. For math, you know, it's logical and coherent and has a progression. Reading is cumulative and doesn't work that way. So you got to give some credit. I passed on Yuri's question and I mistakenly didn't engage in this. I don't think it's fair, right, to say that they don't teach critical thinking, but that's kind of an after effect of having a head full of vocabulary and knowledge. It's very, very difficult to teach thinking skills directly. It's I say this all the time, that reading comprehension and these cognitive skills, they are not skills you teach, they're conditions you create. Now that said, and I don't have a good answer for the other part of this, why is it? Because you're right that Success Academy kids tend to struggle with Regents exams, with with some of these other, getting into the SHSAT, for example. They've gotten better at it, but they still don't have the level of admissions to these elite educational opportunities that you would be led to believe they should have if everybody's killing it on the 3rd through 8th grade tests, as they are every year. So there's something that's not translating there, right? And I don't have a good answer for you for what it is. So in other words, to sum up, I think they are better than you think in terms of their curriculum and instruction, but there's still some magic that's missing there. And the other point I want to make about homework, and this gets to do with operations as well. It was a great day when I was able to check homework at all, let alone one day for correctness and the other 4 days for completion. I kind of did it like this, like, oh, look, I've got a pile of homework. Somebody did it. The real great thing that I think success did, and I just said I'm not her cheerleader, but this I think is worth following in other schools. They have a curriculum. The reason I was able to spend so little time as a teacher on homework, on giving feedback, on developing relationships, was because I was spending as a teacher 10, 20, 30 hours a week online planning lessons from scratch, because that's what I was led to believe is best practice. Oh, Mr. Pondiscio, you're the best person to know what each of your students need. Well, that's nonsense. So success, whether their curriculum is A, B, C, or D, there's a curriculum. That just changes the job of the teacher. So now they can spend that time, even if it is just checking homework only and looking at it in depth one day a week. They are spending far more time than I ever did studying student work, building relationships, not planning lessons from scratch, but planning to teach the lessons. So, I mean, the way you're describing this sounds like, at least the middle school level, they've got a ways to go. But it is a damn sight better than what I did when I was a teacher.
And I agree with you. The reading comprehension for him is extremely high. They really focus heavily on elevating their reading skills, and that is important in the state test structure, and it's important in life. It was more that when he starts getting exposed to the old way of doing it, that you suddenly, it's like kind of jarring, and you see the difference suddenly, and you wonder how he'll integrate if he leaves Success after 8th grade, when he switches back into an old model of education. Is it going to be disruptive to him or good for him? I don't really know. Sadly, we only get one chance for each kid. What was the question?
Where's your son going to go to high school?
Well, he's at Midtown West. He'll finish 8th grade next year. So he hasn't, he had an opportunity to do the DREAM program to prepare for the SHSAT, but he's been balking at it because I go to school, 9.5 hours a day. I don't want more work, is the pushback we've gotten from him. But
Garrett, thank you. I do want to squeeze in one more question because we have a question from the chat. And Garrett, as a mom of 4 boys, I heard you loud and clear about how much time can be spent on Pokemon cards and all sorts of other things that require a great deal of memorization and effort, and how much effort will be expended not to do a minimal amount of homework. It's very impressive.
Good.
We have a question in the chat that I've been asked to read from Natasha that says, can you share insights about special education and related services in Success Academy versus public and private?
Yeah, I don't think it's fair or correct to say that they don't do any. Do they do as much as the district schools? No. Do they deal with the absolute hardest to teach kids? No, not as much. I mean,
And
the story that I told about this kid who was counseled out, or may, you know, they may or may not have been counseled out, depending on how you define it. Um, the vehicle that they used to really pressure the parents was to say, look, this kid needs a 12-1-1, and we don't have a 12-1-1. Now they did. They have like, I think, 17 or 20 12-1-1 classrooms, but not one in the school that I was at, and not one nearby. So the need for a 12-1-1 meant he would have to leave and go someplace else.
okay, that is, I don't see any other questions in the chat. Although, sorry, I spoke too soon. There's a question from Chen Kwok that is, are there any data on how Success Academy students are doing in college?
Not a lot. I mean, they've only graduated 2 very, very small classes. I speculate, if you read between the lines in the book, that they may struggle. And it has to do with the issues that the other gentleman, and forgive me, I can't remember his name, was talking about, you know, about how the 8th grade test scores may not be translating into tougher academic challenges. The closest analogy that we have is the experience of KIPP students, which is another big charter network, which you may know. They have literally sent thousands of kids. They've been around for a long time. They've got over 200 schools. There are thousands of KIPP, so-called scholars, on college campuses. And forgive me if everybody knows this, but you know, a few years ago they did a study of their own, what they call KIPsters, and found, you know, 2 remarkable things. It's the same thing, but 2 different perspectives. You know, KIPP wanted to see 75% of their graduates get to and through college, because that's, you know, that's the rate roughly at which affluent, you know, white Americans, sons and daughters attend and graduate from college. It turned out the actual number was 33%, which was a big disappointment, but that's 4 times better than the average for low-income kids of color. So you could look at that one of 2 ways. Either they were wildly successful based on the chances of those kids getting to and through college at birth, or wildly unsuccessful based on their own metric. If I'm a betting man, and this is just a bet, I have no data, because again, you know, the leading edge is 16 kids in sophomore year, plus the freshmen. It would not surprise me at all to find out that some of those kids struggle when they get to college, and the why of that is complicated. In other words, for the KIPP kids, it wasn't necessarily academic preparation. Some of it was social, some of it was resources, and there's now programs at colleges all across the country to help so-called first-generation kids persist in college. I've written about this at length for a magazine called Education Next. KIPP, in the years since that study, has been leading in terms of developing these programs to keep kids attached and persistent in college. But as I note in the book, at present, Success Academy has no plans for any of that whatsoever. So again, just a bet, but I'm guessing that they may learn some of those same lessons that KIPP did. But also, having said that, if that happens, you know, you could bet your bottom dollar that, you know, Moskowitz is not somebody who's going to sit around wondering why this is happening. She will act. She's not prone to admiring problems.
Here we go.
Yes, I had a question. So based upon your prior teaching experience in the public school system, and you're being embedded in Success Academy, what do you think, and you kind of touched on this in your conversation with Garrett, but what do you think they're doing right that we could try to implement, and is there anything that is practical that actually could be implemented in the New York City public school system or in our district? And what are they doing wrong, or what do you think we're doing wrong that we could do differently?
Well, I was going to say, it depends on what you mean by we, you know, and what's the end size for we. Look, this is where I'm an unapologetic school choice guy. You know, I'm just deeply skeptical of the idea. When people say one size doesn't fit all, they mean something very different than, you know, they could mean, you know, any number of things. What I tend to mean is that my kid is not your kid. You know, my kid was an athlete. She wanted a you know, that was if she couldn't play volleyball, she wouldn't have gotten out of bed in the morning. You know, your kid may be a musician. Your kid may be a math genius. Your kid may love history, etc. So it's really, I just don't like being in the business of saying every school must do X, with some caveats. I mean, I think the reason that Success is so successful, no pun intended, among low-income parents is because they're offering them something that by and large has not existed. And Garrett touched on it before. These schools are exceptionally well run. Your kid is safe. Your kid is being challenged. Your kid is learning a lot. Um, and your kid is going to school with other kids who are just as, and whose parents are just as invested and bought in as you are. You know, I'm guessing that if you were within the sound of my voice, there has never been a single day that you did not know that your kid was going to college, that you did not subtly communicate those expectations to him or her. It's the water in which our children swim. It's not the water in which low-income families of color in places like the South Bronx swim. And some of these things can be homilies, right, in public education. You know, oh, we teach for high expectations. Well, you know, it's high expectations are the results of 1,000 little details, you know, and subtle bits of inequity that tend to undermine, you know, kids and families. So I think the thing that they have nailed is the school culture. And I talk about this at some length in the book. It's one thing to say, look, this is a first-rate school culture. You could do a lot of things with this when every adult, again, is pulling in the same direction. But boy, that's easy to say and hard to do because it does require, in my opinion, that active parental volition, that parent raising his or her hand saying, that's what I want for my kid. You can't impose that. You know, there's a lot of, in other words, could, you know, and this is where I think I most strongly disagree with Eva Moskowitz. And for what it's worth, make of this what you will. I've not had a single conversation with her about this book. I've come to understand that she's not happy about certain aspects of it, and I've come to understand that the reason that she's unhappy with it may have something to do with the fact that she believes that this could be the default setting for American education, that every school should be like this. And don't get me wrong, I'm a defender of these schools. I think they're fantastic. But that's not the same thing as saying that every student should go to one of those schools or every school should be like that. You simply cannot impose this curriculum, this culture, these expectations on people who do not willingly sign up for it.
Robert, can I just say, isn't to some extent what you're describing in some extent actually some of our screen schools, that these screen schools that we have kind of create their own culture, they're in demand, you have parents that want them and that they have reputations, rightly or wrongly deserved, of this culture of success or expectations. Isn't that kind of, haven't we created a culture to some extent with our screen schools?
I assume so, but that's just an assumption. You know, I have not spent any time really inside of this, you know, the Stuyvesants and Bronx Sciences of the world. So I can't say. Well, the difference, I guess, is that in the case of Success Academy, it is a conscious construct. I mean, they are absolutely clear in messaging to parents what their culture is all about. I don't know that that's the case. It may be de facto. I mean, when you put, you know, 1,000 incredibly smart kids and really good teachers in a building, it creates a certain intellectual environment that becomes the de facto culture. But I have no idea to what degree that is a conscious construct in a place like a Stuyvesant. But I mean, and I hate to reduce this to homilies, because we do this all the time, and I hate when we do this in education, or bumper stickers. But I mean, the one thing I think I'm right about this is that it's very, very easy to spout the homilies of oh, we value every child and we hold everyone to high expectations. It's really hard to do. And it doesn't always happen. And look, I'll be blunt, you know, the whiter and richer you are, the more likely you are going to get that. And the poorer and blacker and browner you are, the less likely you're going to get that. And we have to be honest about that.
Robert, we first of all, thank you very, very much for joining us this evening. If anyone has a very last minute short question, I can try to squeeze it in, but we had asked you to come for an hour and you've given us a little bit over an hour. And I'm very appreciative of that. I think, you know, It would be an error to think of this book just about success as just a book about Success Academy, because there are so many important educational issues that became very clear to me, especially around the conversation around equity, but also the very thoughtful analysis about curriculum and what teachers spend their time doing instead of teaching when we ask them to design their own curriculum. Those are, and I think they're related. The equity conversation and that conversation is obviously deeply intertwined. So the book was a fascinating read. I'm very thrilled and happy that you have kicked off our book series with us, because it was a wonderful book to do so with. And you shared a lot of great things with us. I'm going to unmute all, so we can all say goodbye and thank you.
If anybody wants to continue this conversation, I have a love-hate relationship with Twitter, mostly hate, but you can reach me there. My DMs, my direct messages are open. I'm not hard to find. rpondiscio@aol.com. I've had that email address longer than some people here have been alive. So feel free to reach out to me, and maybe we can do part 2 of this and do it over a few drinks at a nice Upper East Side Irish pub one evening when we can all get back to our normal lives.
I cannot wait for Irish pubs to come back into my life. They've been missing for far too long. Robert, thank you very, very much. And thank you everyone for joining us for the first Book Talk series.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me, folks. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you.